November 8, 1942, Richmond, California, midnight. A shipyard that didn't exist 2 years ago hummed with acetylene torches and the clang of steel on steel. Henry Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship in his life, stood watching as workers laid the keel for what would become the SS Robert E. Peary. What happened over the next 4 days would become the stuff of legend, but more importantly, it would shatter every assumption the German High Command held about American industrial capacity. The Germans had a name for these vessels emerging from American shipyards. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Blechbüchsen, tin cans. Kaiser coffins, some U-boat commanders called them, laughing at intelligence reports describing ships welded together by housewives and farmers, assembled like children's toys, sailing across the Atlantic with hulls so thin you could supposedly punch through them with a good kick. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of Germany's tonnage war strategy, had done the mathematics. His calculations were precise, his logic unassailable. To starve Britain into submission, U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. The British could build perhaps 300,000 tons per month to replace losses. The Americans, despite their industrial might, were hampered by traditional shipbuilding methods that required 6 to 8 months per vessel. The equation was simple, the outcome inevitable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Dönitz had written it himself in his war diary on April 14, 1942. "The enemy's shipping forms a single totality," he declared. "It is therefore immaterial where a ship is sunk. In the last analysis, it has to be replaced by a new construction." This was the foundation of the tonnage war. Pure mathematics, cold calculation. Sink ships faster than the Allies could, build them, and the war would be won in the Atlantic, regardless of what happened on any battlefield. By mid-1942, the strategy appeared to be working brilliantly. In the period U-boat crews called the Second Happy Time, German submarines sent 325,000 tons to the bottom in June alone. The month before, 311,000 tons. In March, 327,000. The graph lines on the charts in Dönitz's command post at Kernavelle showed Allied shipping losses climbing, while replacement capacity remained relatively flat. Victory appeared to be a matter of arithmetic and time, but there was a variable in that equation that German intelligence had fundamentally miscalculated, not the industrial capacity of the United States, which German analysts actually overestimated rather than underestimated. The BDO, the U-boat Command Intelligence Section, had concluded Americans could produce 15,300,000 tons of shipping in 1942 and 1943 combined. The actual figure would be 17 million tons. But that wasn't the critical error. The mistake lay in understanding not how much America could produce, but how fast it could learn to produce it. The Liberty ship was born from British desperation and American pragmatism. In 1940, with U-boats sinking merchant vessels faster than Britain's shipyards could replace them, the British government placed an order for 60 Ocean-class freighters from American yards. These were simple vessels with a single 2,500 horsepower compound steam engine, an outdated but reliable design. Britain specified coal-fired plants because it had extensive coal mines and no significant domestic oil production. The design was deliberately archaic, deliberately simple. Speed wasn't the goal, numbers were. The United States Maritime Commission modified the British design, in part to conform to American construction practices, but more importantly, to make it even quicker and cheaper to build. The result was designated EC2, SC1, emergency cargo, size 2 for a ship between 400 and 450 feet long, steam engine, design C1. It was a designation that would never catch the public imagination. President Franklin Roosevelt, in reviewing the blueprints at the White House, called it a dreadful-looking object. Time magazine dubbed it an ugly duckling. But when the first of these emergency cargo ships, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched on September 27, 1941, Roosevelt invoked the Revolutionary War patriot's famous declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death." These ships, he said, would bring liberty to Europe. The name Liberty Ship was born. The Liberty Ship was 441 feet long and 56 feet wide. Its three-cylinder reciprocating steam engine produced 2,500 horsepower and could push the vessel to 11 knots, not fast. A determined runner could almost keep pace with a Liberty ship at full speed. Its 5 cargo holds could carry over 9,000 tons of cargo, with additional space for airplanes, tanks, and locomotives lashed to the deck. It was designed, quite literally, as a 5-year vessel, an expendable, if necessary, material of war. Nobody expected these ships to compete with peacetime merchant vessels in speed, equipment, or general serviceability. They just needed to float, carry cargo, and cross an ocean before a U-boat found them. Everything else was secondary. What made the Liberty ship revolutionary wasn't its design. The design was deliberately retrograde. What changed everything was how it would be built. And the man who would transform American shipbuilding had never constructed a vessel in his life. Henry John Kaiser was born on May 9, 1882, in Sprout Brook, New York, the son of German immigrants. He left school after 8th grade to help support his family, working his way west through a series of jobs: hardware salesman, construction foreman, road builder. He had a reputation for working 12 to 15-hour days, sometimes 20. His specialties were sales, construction, and large-scale engineering projects. Most importantly, he understood something that traditional shipbuilders, with their generations of craft knowledge and guild traditions, did not. He understood that in modern industrial war, the perfect was the enemy of the good enough. Kaiser's company had been part of the consortium that built Hoover Dam, Bonneville Dam, and Grand Coulee Dam. He knew concrete and steel. He knew logistics and labor management. He knew how to coordinate thousands of workers on massive projects with unforgiving deadlines. What he didn't know was ships. When the British contract came through in December 1940, Kaiser had never been to sea. It's not even clear if he'd ever set foot on a ship. His partners at Todd Shipyards had the maritime expertise, but Todd couldn't keep pace with Kaiser's vision and soon left the partnership. Kaiser was on his own, building an industry he knew nothing about, and that ignorance would prove to be his greatest asset. Traditional shipbuilding was a craft. Each vessel was constructed from the keel up by one crew of workers who followed a process refined over centuries. A ship was built as a single, continuous piece, with craftsmen moving along the hull as it took shape, each worker needing to understand the entire vessel. It was elegant, it was skillful, and in 1941, with Britain's merchant fleet being slaughtered in the Atlantic, it was catastrophically slow. The average construction time was 230 days. The best yards, working with experienced crews, could sometimes reduce that to 150 days. That wasn't nearly fast enough. Kaiser looked at shipbuilding the way he'd looked at dam construction. Not as a continuous process, but as an assembly problem. He visited a Ford assembly plant and returned with a revolutionary idea. What if ships weren't built from the keel up, but assembled from prefabricated sections? What if, instead of one crew building one ship in sequence, multiple crews built multiple ship sections simultaneously, then assembled them at the end? The concept violated every tradition of the shipbuilding craft, which was precisely why it might work. The technical challenge was joining those sections. Traditionally, ships were riveted. Riveting was tested. Riveting was trusted. Riveting created joints that could flex, that could absorb stress, that could stop a crack from propagating through an entire hull. But riveting was slow. It required skilled craftsmen. Each rivet had to be heated, placed, and hammered by hand. Riveting accounted for 1/3 of the labor costs in traditional ship construction. Kaiser's solution was welding. Welding was faster. Welding was simpler to teach. One welder could do the work of 2 riveters. Welding required lighter equipment, less lifting, and created a continuous steel hull instead of overlapping plates. It had never been done on this scale before. The United States had a large shipbuilding base that could rivet ships. It had almost no capacity to weld ships. Traditional shipbuilders warned that welded vessels would crack, would fail, would send crews to the bottom. Kaiser welded them anyway. He built the shipyard in Richmond, California, on land that had been empty 2 years before. He didn't have skilled shipbuilders, so he redefined what shipbuilding required. He broke the construction process into specialized tasks, so each worker only needed to learn one job, not the entire craft. Did it take years to train a well-rounded shipbuilder? Fine. He'd build ships without well-rounded shipbuilders. He recruited workers from everywhere, from the Grand Coulee Dam project, from farms across the Midwest, from secretaries and housewives, who'd never seen industrial work. Thousands of women entered the workforce, learning to weld, to fit, to assemble. Wendy the welder, not Rosie the riveter, became the symbol of Kaiser's revolution. He recruited thousands of African Americans when other industries maintained color bars. When unions tried to exclude black workers, Kaiser got the federal government to overrule them. "We do not ask what their color is," one recruiter stated. "If they know one end of a monkey wrench from the other, we'll take them as helpers," Kaiser said. "If they don't, we'll label each end." He hired ballet dancers as fitters because they could tightrope across steel structures without the years of training traditional ship fitters required. He built housing for workers, schools, libraries, medical facilities. He created Vanport, Oregon's second-largest city during the war, a complete community of more than 10,000 homes on the Columbia River. He established the first health maintenance organization to keep workers healthy and productive. Everything was designed around a single principle: build ships faster than they could be sunk. Everything else was negotiable. The transformation was staggering. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to build. Within months, Kaiser's modular construction and welding techniques reduced that to 197 days, then to 45 days. Then, incredibly, to an average of 42 days by 1944. But even that average concealed what was truly happening. On November 8, 1942, workers at the Richmond shipyard laid the keel for the SS Robert E. Peary at 12:01 a.m. They assembled 250,000 parts weighing 14 million pounds. Prefabricated sections built across California arrived by train and truck. Bow units, stern assemblies, complete deckhouses, double bottom sections, bulkheads. Each piece built simultaneously at different locations, then transported to Richmond and for final assembly. The work proceeded around the clock. Welders worked in shifts, their torches creating showers of sparks that lit the night. Cranes lifted sections weighing hundreds of tons into position. The hull took shape not from the keel up, but from all directions at once, sections fitting together like pieces of an enormous puzzle. On November 12th, 4 days and 15.5 hours after the keel was laid, the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the launching ramp into San Francisco Bay. The crowd watched in stunned silence, then erupted in cheers. The previous record had been 10 days for the Liberty ship Joseph N. Teal. Kaiser's workers had cut it by more than half. 4 days. It was inconceivable. It was impossible. It had happened. The publicity photographs went everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, newsreels. The miracle man of American industry had done it again. But there was a detail most reports omitted. The 4-day figure represented assembly time, not total construction time. The final fitting out, installing machinery, equipment, furnishings, took additional weeks. The SS Robert E. Peary went to war on November 22nd, 10 days after launch. Still, even counting fitting out time, the total was a fraction of what traditional methods required. And more importantly, the principle was proven. Modular construction worked. Welding worked. Assembly line shipbuilding could produce vessels at a rate no one had thought possible. By 1943, 3 Liberty ships were being launched every day in America, not every week, not every month, every single day. 18 shipyards across the country, from Maine to California, built these vessels. Kaiser's yards or yards using Kaiser's techniques produced 27% of all ships ordered by the U.S. Maritime Commission during the war. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards constructed 2,710 Liberty ships, the largest class of ships ever produced to a single design in history. The numbers were staggering, but they told only part of the story. Each Liberty ship could carry 10,000 tons of cargo, though in wartime they often carried far more. Ships were loaded to their plimsoll lines, indicating safe levels, then deck cargo was added. Tanks, aircraft, landing craft, whatever the military needed on the other side of the Atlantic or Pacific. A Liberty ship, the Maritime Commission calculated, paid for itself if it completed half of one voyage. A one-way trip was considered successful. The economics were brutal and simple. If the ship made it across once, it had justified its $2 million construction cost. Anything after that was profit. But there was a problem, and the problem was terrifying. The welded construction that made Liberty ships so quick to build also made them vulnerable in ways traditional riveted vessels were not. In 1943, 3 Liberty ships catastrophically split in half without warning. The SS John P. Gaines sank on November 24, 1943, with the loss of 10 lives. The ship simply cracked in two and went down. Then the SS Schenectady broke in half while sitting at the dock in Portland, Oregon, in January 1943, the day after it was launched. Not in a storm, not under stress, just sitting there. The hull suddenly fractured completely around the ship's girth, with a sound witnesses described as a gunshot. 12 Liberty ships broke in half during the war. Nearly 1,500 instances of significant brittle fractures were documented. 30% of the Liberty ship fleet eventually experienced cracking problems. Suspicion immediately fell on the shipyards. Inexperienced workers, rushed construction, shoddy welding. German propaganda seized on the failures as proof of American industrial incompetence. Those cardboard ships, U-boat commanders joked. Those Kaiser coffins. Built by women and amateurs, the Kriegsmarine claimed the vessels were so poorly constructed that some broke apart in heavy seas without a single torpedo strike. It was excellent propaganda. It was also wrong. A British metallurgist named Constance Tipper of Cambridge University investigated the failures and discovered the actual cause. The steel used in Liberty ships experienced a ductile to brittle transition at cold temperatures. The same steel that was flexible and strong in warm water became brittle in the frigid North Atlantic. When temperatures dropped below the critical point, the steel changed its fundamental properties. Cracks that would have stopped at a rivet joint in traditional construction propagated through the continuous welded hull. The square corners of the cargo hatches acted as stress concentrators, where cracks could nucleate. The problem wasn't the welding, it was the steel's metallurgical properties in cold water. Minor revisions to the hatches and various reinforcements were applied to later Liberty ships. Rounded corners replaced square ones. Riveted seam straps were added across the deck to arrest crack propagation. The problem was understood and managed, though never completely eliminated. The critical point, though, was this. Despite the structural failures, despite the losses, despite the very real danger of sailing in a welded ship through North Atlantic winter storms, Liberty ships kept sailing. They kept carrying cargo, and they kept being built faster than U-boats could sink them, because in the end, the tonnage war came down to one brutal equation. Could American shipyards build merchant vessels faster than German submarines could destroy them? In 1942, it appeared the Germans would win. U-boats sank more tonnage that year than Allied shipyards, including American yards, could replace. But 1942 was also the year Henry Kaiser's revolution reached full production, and in 1943, the equation reversed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics that had looked so certain to Karl Dönitz in 1942 began to unravel in 1943. In July of that year, A milestone was reached that German naval intelligence initially refused to believe. Allied shipyards, led by American production, built more tonnage in that single month than Axis forces had sunk since the war began. The line graphs that had shown German success climbing and Allied capacity declining suddenly inverted. The tonnage built now exceeded tonnage sunk. And the gap wasn't narrow, it was widening. By the end of 1943, American shipyards had produced 128 Liberty ships in November alone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That's more than 4 ships per day. In a single month, the United States launched over 1 million tons of new merchant shipping. To put that in perspective, that was more tonnage than the entire German submarine fleet had sunk in some of the best months of the Second Happy Time. The U-boats were still hunting, still killing, still sending ships to the bottom with terrifying regularity, but they were no longer winning the tonnage war. They were losing it, and losing it badly. The German response was to intensify the submarine campaign. Dönitz, now promoted to Grand Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the entire Kriegsmarine in January 1943, finally had the 300 U-boats, he'd said in 1939, were necessary to win the Atlantic battle. By the end of 1942, the Type 7 U-boat production had reached its height. Wolfpacks scored record kills. The tactics were refined. The crews were experienced. Everything Dönitz had planned for years was finally in place. And it wasn't enough. In March 1943, the U-boat offensive reached what appeared to be a crescendo. Multiple Wolfpacks attacked convoys in the Atlantic Narrows, the gap between Greenland and Iceland where air cover was weakest. Convoy SC-121 lost 12 merchantmen and 2 landing craft over 3 days. 56,243 gross tons sunk, 480 seamen killed. The escorts, an under-strength American group led by the Coast Guard cutter USCGC Spencer, were overwhelmed. Then the Wolfpacks turned on convoy HX-228-60 Allied merchant ships carrying over 500,000 tons of war supplies from New York to Liverpool. On the night of March 10th, 13 U-boats from the newly formed Wolfpack Neuland slipped past the escorts and launched torpedoes into the formation. The SS William C. Gorgas, a Liberty ship laden with 8,000 tons of general cargo, including 900 tons of TNT, was hit just after midnight. The torpedoes struck amidships. The explosion was catastrophic, but what happened next revealed something the Germans hadn't fully appreciated about these supposedly flimsy American cargo ships. The Liberty ship didn't disintegrate. Despite carrying nearly 1,000 tons of high explosives, despite the torpedo strike, the vessel stayed afloat long enough for the crew to abandon ship. 70 men made it into lifeboats. The William C. Gorgas slipped beneath the waves 1 minute later, and then the TNT detonated. The underwater explosion was massive. It seriously injured several crewmen on U-757, the submarine that had torpedoed her. The blast knocked out the U-boat's starboard diesel engine and batteries and rendered the submarine unable to dive. The U-boat commander had to abort the patrol and limp back to Saint-Nazaire, France. One of the Kaiser coffins had nearly killed its attacker even in death. But the broader battle told a different story. Despite deploying 13 submarines against convoy HX-228, the Germans managed to sink only 3 ships. The weather was terrible. Heavy storms made torpedo accuracy nearly impossible. The escorts, led by the British destroyer HMS Harvester under Commander A.A. Tite, fought with desperate skill. The U-boats were forced to break off. Of the 60 merchant ships in the convoy, 57 made it to Liverpool. 3 lost. 95% survival rate. That was the new mathematics of the Atlantic. And that was before the Allies introduced their full array of technological countermeasures. By May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its turning point. The Allies had broken the German naval Enigma code, allowing convoys to be routed around known U-boat positions. Shipborne high-frequency direction finders, called Huff-Duff, could detect U-boat radio transmissions and provide precise bearings. Long-range aircraft equipped with centimetric radar could patrol the mid-Atlantic gap. Escort carriers provided air cover where land-based planes couldn't reach. Improved depth charges and ahead-throwing weapons like Hedgehog gave convoy escorts deadly new tools. And most importantly, there were simply more escorts, more aircraft, more resources dedicated to protecting the merchant ships that were now pouring from American shipyards in unprecedented numbers. The month of May 1943 would be remembered in U-boat service as Black May. 41 U-boats were lost. Dönitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely. The offensive had failed. Not because the U-boats stopped fighting, not because the tactics were wrong or the crews incompetent, but because the Allies were building ships faster than the submarines could sink them and protecting those ships with technology and tactics the Germans couldn't counter. The tonnage war was over. Germany had lost. Dönitz himself wrote the epitaph on May 24, 1943, ordering U-boats to cease operations in the North Atlantic. The losses were unsustainable. He would continue to send submarines to sea until the very end of the war, but they were no longer hunting merchant ships with any hope of strategic success. They were tying down Allied resources, relieving pressure on other Wehrmacht branches, dying in what amounted to a sustained delaying action. Of the 859 U-boats that sortied on war patrols during the war, 648 were lost. 75%. Of those lost, 215 went down on their first patrol. 33% of boats that sailed operationally for the first time never came back. The U-boat arm suffered the highest casualty rate in the German military. Around 30,000 of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats perished. And what they died fighting was, ultimately, American industrial capacity embodied in those ugly, simple, supposedly fragile Liberty ships. The vessels German intelligence had dismissed as tin cans, the ship's U-boat commanders called cardboard boxes, the Kaiser coffins that were supposed to crack and sink on their own without needing a torpedo. By the end of the war, of the 2,710 Liberty ships built, only 196 were lost to all causes. 7%. Some were sunk by U-boats, some by Japanese submarines in the Pacific, some by aircraft, some by mines, some by storms and structural failure. But 93% survived. 2,514 Liberty ships made it through the war intact. More importantly, they delivered their cargo. This was the metric that truly mattered, not how many ships were built, not how fast they were constructed, but how much material actually reached the battlefronts. The Liberty ships, supplemented by the larger and faster Victory ships introduced in 1944, carried the weight of the Allied war effort across two oceans. They transported tanks and aircraft, ammunition and fuel, food and medical supplies, troops and equipment, everything needed to fight a global war on multiple continents simultaneously. The total tonnage delivered by Liberty ships alone exceeded 60 million tons. 60 million tons of cargo that crossed oceans, survived submarines and storms, and arrived where it needed to be. To understand what 60 million tons meant in practical terms, consider this. A single Liberty ship carrying 10,000 tons could transport 300 Sherman tanks, or 2,000 jeeps, or enough wheat to feed a small city for months. Multiply that by 6,000 voyages. That's not counting the ships that made multiple trips. Some Liberty ships completed dozens of voyages during the war. The John W. Brown, one of only 2 surviving operational Liberty ships today, made 9 voyages during World War II, participated in the D-Day invasion's southern France component, and transported German prisoners of war from North Africa to the United States. Just one ship, but its cargo capacity multiplied across multiple trips, represented a staggering contribution to the Allied logistics chain. The German generals who had laughed at intelligence reports about American ship construction weren't laughing by 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in North Africa, had written repeatedly about his supply problems. British interdiction of Axis shipping across the Mediterranean was strangling his Africa corps. Meanwhile, British and American forces in North Africa were supplied by convoys that crossed the entire Atlantic, sailed through the Mediterranean under air attack, and still delivered more material than Rommel received across a sea measured in hundreds of miles rather than thousands. The disparity was impossible to ignore. Those supposedly inferior American cargo ships were delivering fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment in quantities that made German logistics look medieval by comparison. After the Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy, the disparity became even more apparent. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was a logistical achievement that would have been impossible without the Liberty ship fleet. In the months before D-Day, Liberty ships and other merchant vessels transported 3 million American and Allied servicemen across the Atlantic to Britain, not in a single convoy, not in a single month, but in a sustained, systematic sea lift that moved an entire army across an ocean while that army's enemy watched helplessly. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. They had U-boats at sea, they had the Atlantic Wall fortifications, they had radar and reconnaissance, and they could do nothing to stop the largest amphibious operation in history from assembling just across the English Channel. On D-Day itself and in the weeks that followed, Liberty ships formed the backbone of the supply effort that kept Allied forces fighting in France. They carried fuel for tanks and aircraft, ammunition for artillery, rations for soldiers, medical supplies for field hospitals, replacement vehicles, spare parts, everything an army needed to advance across France and into Germany. The ships were vulnerable in the Channel, subject to mines and air attack. Some were lost. But the flow never stopped. For every Liberty ship sunk, 10 more were already at sea, 20 more were loading in American ports, and 30 more were under construction in shipyards from Richmond to Portland to Wilmington. The Pacific War told the same story. Liberty ships carried the material that enabled American forces to advance from island to island across the vast Pacific. The distances were staggering. From San Francisco to Guadalcanal was over 5,000 nautical miles. From California to the Philippines, nearly 6,000 miles. Liberty ships and their larger Victory ship cousins made those journeys repeatedly, often sailing alone or in small groups rather than heavily escorted convoys, taking their chances with Japanese submarines and accepting losses as the price of maintaining supply lines across the largest ocean on Earth. The SS Stephen Hopkins, a Liberty ship, became the first American merchant vessel to sink a German surface raider when it fought the commerce raider Steer in the South Atlantic. The Hopkins was outgunned. The crew knew they were going to die. They fought anyway, scoring hits that would eventually sink the German raider before the Liberty ship went down. The cargo capacity and the sheer numbers of these vessels meant that losing ships, while tragic, didn't cripple the American war effort. There were always more coming. This was the reality that the German High Command confronted in the final years of the war. The tonnage war strategy had been mathematically sound based on all historical precedent. In World War I, unrestricted submarine warfare had nearly forced Britain to sue for peace. The same strategy, applied with more submarines and better tactics, should have worked in World War II. What the Germans hadn't anticipated was that the United States would revolutionize not just ship production, but the entire concept of industrial warfare. Henry Kaiser's Liberty ships weren't better ships than traditional merchant vessels in any conventional sense. They were slower than most pre-war freighters. They were less comfortable. They had structural weaknesses. They were, as Roosevelt said, ugly ducklings. But they had one overwhelming advantage. They could be built fast enough and in sufficient numbers to overwhelm any submarine campaign. The final irony was that the welding techniques German propagandists had mocked as proof of American incompetence became the future of shipbuilding worldwide. After the war, both Japan and South Korea rebuilt their maritime industries using Kaiser's modular construction methods. The welding that had caused brittle fracture problems in Liberty ships was studied, understood, and improved. Modern welding codes and practices trace their development directly to the lessons learned from Liberty ship failures. The metallurgy of shipbuilding steel advanced dramatically because of research into why Liberty ships cracked in cold water. The industry Kaiser entered as a complete amateur emerged from the war transformed, with American techniques adopted worldwide. Today, virtually all large ships are welded, not riveted. The modular construction methods Kaiser pioneered are standard practice in modern shipyards. The division of labor, the specialization of tasks, the use of prefabricated sections assembled by workers with limited training in a narrow skill set, all of this became the foundation of post-war shipbuilding. But during the war itself, in the moment, what mattered was simpler. The Liberty ships kept sailing. U-boat commanders who had joked about tin cans and cardboard boxes watched through their periscopes as convoy after convoy crossed the Atlantic. They attacked. They sank ships. They watched crews die in the freezing water. And then they watched the convoys continue, more ships than escorts could protect, more cargo than a dozen submarines could stop. The mathematics worked against them. For every ship they sank, 3 more were already at sea, and 10 more were being built. The industrial base they were fighting wasn't a traditional maritime power carefully crafting each vessel. It was an assembly line that treated ships like mass-produced commodities, accepting losses, accepting imperfections, accepting structural failures, and simply building more. The SS Robert E. Peary, the ship built in 4 days that had started as a publicity stunt, went on to serve throughout the war. It made multiple voyages carrying war supplies from San Francisco to New Caledonia, from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal, from Chile to Cuba to Savannah. The record-setting construction time hadn't made it fragile, the rushed assembly hadn't doomed it, the supposedly inferior welding held. During one voyage, the Peary saved American soldiers trapped near a beach on a Pacific island held by the Japanese. The crew earned recognition for risking their ship to provide fire support and evacuation. The ugly duckling, built in less than a week by workers who'd never built a ship before, turned out to be exactly what it was designed to be. Good enough, built fast enough, and available when needed. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, Liberty ships had carried 2/3 of all cargo that left the United States for overseas destinations. Not half, not a majority. 2/3. That's the measure of their contribution. They weren't glamorous, they weren't fast, they weren't perfect, but they were there, in numbers no enemy could match, carrying the material that kept Allied armies fighting on 3 continents. The German generals who had laughed at Kaiser coffins and cardboard ships ended the war having been defeated, in part, by those very vessels. The tonnage war that was supposed to starve Britain into submission instead demonstrated that American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, could outproduce any attempt to destroy its output. Karl Donitz, who had calculated so carefully that 300 U-boats could win the Atlantic battle, lived to see his strategy fail not because his mathematics were wrong, but because the variables changed. American shipyards didn't build ships the way Germans thought shipyards worked. Henry Kaiser didn't approach maritime construction the way naval architects thought it should be approached. The entire American war production effort operated on principles that violated European assumptions about how industrial warfare functioned. Mass production over craftsmanship, speed over perfection, quantity over quality, replacement over preservation. It was a different philosophy of war, and in the Atlantic, it won. After the war, many Liberty ships continued serving. Some became merchant vessels in peacetime fleets. Some were sold to foreign countries. Some were stored in reserve fleets in case they were needed again. Most were eventually scrapped, their 5-year design life extended to 20 or 30 years of service. A few survive today as museum ships. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, berthed in San Francisco, and the SS John W. Brown, moored in Baltimore, remain operational. They occasionally leave their berths under their own power, the last Liberty ships still capable of sailing. Visitors can tour the cargo holds, walk the decks, see the triple expansion steam engine, and understand what these vessels represented. Not technological marvels, not engineering triumphs, but industrial warfare incarnate. The human cost of the Atlantic campaign was staggering. Beyond the 30,000 U-boat crewmen who died, approximately 30,000 Allied merchant seamen were killed during the war. They sailed on Liberty ships and other merchant vessels knowing the odds, knowing the dangers, knowing that a torpedo could send them into freezing water hundreds of miles from land with minimal chance of rescue. The survival rate for torpedoed merchant ships was horrifyingly low. The 12 men who died when the SS William C. Gorgas sank were among thousands who perished in similar attacks, but the crews kept sailing. New ships kept launching. The supply lines held. The Liberty Ship program's legacy extends beyond shipbuilding into American industrial culture. Kaiser's methods of mass mobilization, rapid training, and division of labor influenced post-war manufacturing across industries. His emphasis on worker welfare, medical care, and community building set precedents for industrial employment practices. Kaiser Permanente, the health maintenance organization he established for shipyard workers, grew into one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States. The workforce integration that brought women and African Americans into shipyard jobs in unprecedented numbers contributed to broader social changes that would accelerate after the war. Wendy the welder became a symbol of women's industrial capability. The Richmond shipyard's successful integration challenged racial barriers in employment. These social impacts rippled far beyond the shipyards themselves. The technological lessons learned from Liberty ship construction influenced engineering education and practice for decades. The brittle fracture problem that caused ships to crack became a foundational case study in fracture mechanics, a field that advanced dramatically because of Liberty ship failures. Constance Tipper's investigation of the steel's ductile to brittle transition led to fundamental understanding of material properties under stress. Modern structural engineering, metallurgy, and welding practices all trace aspects of their development to problems first identified in Liberty ship construction. The failures, in other words, proved as valuable as the successes in advancing engineering knowledge. From a strategic perspective, the Liberty ship program validated a principle that would shape American military doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century. Logistics wins wars, not tactics, not strategy, not even technology in the narrow sense, but the ability to deliver overwhelming material superiority to the battlefield. The Liberty ships didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic through superior design or performance. They won by being built faster than they could be sunk, by delivering more cargo than the enemy could interdict, by creating a logistics pipeline that enemy action could damage but never sever. This principle, that sustainable industrial production matters more than individual combat effectiveness, became central to American military planning in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The German perspective on Liberty ships evolved from mockery to grudging respect to, finally, bitter recognition. U-boat commanders who survived the war acknowledged in post-war interviews that the sheer numbers of Allied merchant ships had made the tonnage war unwinnable. The quality of individual vessels mattered less than the quantity. A submarine could sink a Liberty ship, but 3 more would take its place before the submarine could reload its torpedo tubes. The convoy system, improved detection technology, and Allied air superiority all contributed to the U-boat's defeat, but the fundamental problem was that American shipyards were producing tonnage faster than submarines could destroy it. That was the equation that mattered, and no amount of tactical skill or technological innovation on the German side could change it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.